The brutal cycle that ends every civilization and what comes next. This is a presentation about the long-term cycle that we've seen again and again and again throughout the dawn of history, at least of recorded history, that has effectively shown, what to expect with the rise of great nations and world empires, and then also their fall as well. I want to be drawing corollaries between the major threads that connect all of these things together, and then also show where we're at in the current cycle. And then, of course, this wouldn't be a good presentation, or at least hopefully a good presentation, without a resolution at the end as to what exactly comes next, or what is likely to come next, the major scenarios, and how to protect yourself amongst those scenarios. So without further ado, let's get into it right here. We'll be going over the rise and fall of all of the great empires over the past almost 3,000 years. We're going to be talking about ancient Egypt. We're going to be talking about Persia. We're going to be talking about Athens, of course, Rome, which I think is many people's favorites. Then we got Spain, Netherlands, France, and the UK, and then now the United States, which is the current world empire. And we shall start this one off with being the number one in the world is great. And when I say number one in the world, I just mean the major empire of the world. There's always a king of the hill in the world economy. I'm not saying that one nation is like objectively better than another, better culture and stuff like this. Of course, these are subjective things. You may have your own opinions. But we're talking specifically from an economic powerhouse standpoint. We're talking about the number one, typically, which is going to be marked by having the world reserve currency. That's what really gives nations their major power. Yes, it can also be military as well, and in fact, that is a big portion of it. But the main benefit of being the number one world leader is having your national currency as the world reserve currency, which gives you extra special powers and really allows the citizens of that world number one power to live a much higher standard of living compared to others. That's really the thing here. And again, I'm not saying that other countries, are going to be total shit in this whole equation. It's just they're not going to be as good on average, economically speaking. Anyways, all great world powers of the past 2,000 years, actually make that 3,000 years, have followed a very similar cycle. The cycle is not exact, but it certainly does rhyme. And the cycle follows the popularized context of the fourth turning, which you're probably familiar with. And realistically, it can be summarized down to four major portions. It starts with hard times. Hard times create strong men. Strong men create good times. Good times create weak men. And weak men create hard times. Now, I bet that probably most people listening to this presentation have heard that in some form before. It's a lot more nuanced than that. Obviously, strong men doesn't necessarily mean like, big muscular men, but it means strong men who have certain capabilities that were effectively gained from going through very, very difficult times, which forced them to have those adaptations. And those adaptations didn't allow them to just overcome those hard times, but it then transferred into the creation phase where they started to actually, apply that in other ways, creating good times. And then, of course, good times create weak men. Why? Because, you don't need to be that strong man who had the capabilities to overcome those hard times before in order to exist in these good times. You no longer have that stimulus, is what I'm trying to say. Then, once you get those good times, of course, weak men come about just because they haven't had to have been tested as the people before them. And over time, those weak men naturally forget the lessons of the prior strong men, and then they create hard times, and then the cycle repeats. So it's been going on since the dawn of time. I think it's really just a human sort of it's just a human story, really. And that's actually the story of many of probably your favorite, mythological stories. If you watch something like Star Wars, for example, or if you watch Lord of the Rings, of course, or Harry Potter, all of these things follow about the same sort of hero's journey, which is sort of a more individualized version of this society cycle that we're going over here. But it's all related to each other, really. And the cycle repeats again and again and again, ad infinitum, and probably will never stop as long as humans are in charge of this world. Maybe that changes soon with AI coming up, but then again, perhaps they play the same game. We are the programmers after all anyways. So none of this is new is what I'm trying to say, and it is likely due to our innate human psychology, which responds to and the pattern is an adaptation, which is logical and beneficial. It really does make a lot of sense when you understand it from an evolutionary biology standpoint, which we'll go over as well. So let's go over the sort of psychology as to why do hard times create strong men. We went over a little bit in the prior slide, but let's go a little bit deeper here. So from an evolutionary psychology perspective, which is effectively just looking at psychology through the lens of evolutionary adaptations and what would be beneficial, the human mind and body can adapt under pressure. That's really what the essence of this whole thing is about. We adapt under pressure because we are forced to. And if you don't adapt under pressure, what happens? Well, you die, and then you're no longer relevant in the grand scheme of things, or at least not relevant to the progress at that point. So only the strong survive. No, only the people who adapt survive, actually, would be a more accurate statement, but it comes from the same vein. Anyways, hardship triggers a stress response. And repeated exposure to difficulty builds more or less stress inoculation. It's like taking a vaccine, maybe a bad contextual word in today's world. But the point that I'm trying to make is that you take a vaccine, which gives you sort of a sort of impetus of a hard event, and then your body is allowed to respond, overcome it, and then it creates an inoculation against it. Now, of course, in the context of a vaccine, it's typically very safe. You don't have to worry about actually dying. But of course, in the human world, it really is a matter of life and death. So the ability to stay calm and act rationally under pressure is really an evolved stress response, which is gained very difficultly from great difficulty under stress. It's a stress response. And yes, some people do not respond properly. And yeah, that is perhaps natural selection at work, because they're not going to survive, or at least not going to survive well. So this one key thing right here is really the beginning of that whole cycle. A hardship presents the stimulus that some men respond to, and when I say men, I mean people in general. You can apply this to women as well, or whatever the fuck gender pronouns you prefer, whatever, who gives a shit about that shit anyways. What I mean is humans, okay? We're talking about humans here. I'm going to say man because that is how we've usually referred to this for most of recorded history. Again, just understand it's just talking about humans. So yeah, in essence, hard times train men to regulate emotions, solve problems creatively, and endure discomfort. And on all great things, basically to induce societal progress. So once you have those adaptations, you are that type of person who then creates amazing things. And those amazing things create amazing times, naturally. So in a healthy society, these strong men will create traditions and trials that help transfer this hard-earned knowledge from those initial trials and tribulations to future generations. This has, in history, been referred to as a rite of passage. And in today's world, we don't really have that anymore. I mean, some people might think like college is a rite of passage, but I never felt that way. I always felt like college was kind of easy. I barely fucking tried, and you could always pass, or at least just show up a little bit to class and you'd pass. So I never thought of it as like a really worthy stimulus. We, in my opinion, we need better. We need harder trials. We need harder trials in order to maintain those initial lessons learned by that first generation that really created, those amazing times that we enjoy right now. But yes, in a healthy society, that would be the point. And that's what really a lot of past societies have done. And it should be known that in the past, great societies or great empires have endured generally more time at their height than current world powers. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why. Of course, there's a myriad of reasons, I'm sure. But yeah, I would imagine that is among them as well. Anyways, yes, so that is typically used to transfer that knowledge, but naturally, because those future generations do not have the initial extreme stimulus that inspired the first generation of strong men, the fruitful lessons gained from those hard times naturally just become less and less potent. It's just, it's never going to be the same thing as the real thing. I mean, maybe if they have like really, really, really fucking hard rites of passages, I guess, where people are like literally facing life and death, but still, to create that initial stimulus where, it's not just you, but your whole nation is on the brink of just a dumpster fire, or isn't a dumpster fire, and you're overcoming that. I mean, that's just, the stakes are bigger. It's what I'm trying to say. The stakes will never be that big for future generations. But anyways, this is the process in which weak men are created and begin to outnumber the strong men, thus crafting the present in their own. Crafting the present, I mean, crafting society at present into their own image and neglecting the lessons of the past that created the good times because they just don't understand them anymore. They don't understand them, and you can't blame them for not understanding them because, well, for example, right now, did we have to go through World War I or World War II? You know, if you're living right now, probably not. You're probably dead because there's very, 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 very few people around who were a part of those, or especially World War I, but even World War II at this point, there's very, very few people around. Now, I was very lucky because my grandfather actually did fight in World War II, so I was actually able to talk about him about this sort of stuff before he passed. And you could tell just, you know, even when I was quite young, you could tell that it was a extremely scarring event for him. Now, he's a very strong man. He's a very, very, very powerful person and went on to do amazing things actually as well, you know, in business after the war. But yeah, that event absolutely emotionally scarred him. And you could tell, I could tell even as like, you know, even as a dumb 12-year-old, you know, asking him probably very silly questions. But yes, my point is that the men of today will never have, or at least cannot have as of right now, the same experiences as our grandfathers in World War II. It's just, we don't have that event going on right now. Yes, you might have a difficult day, and maybe a similar sort of stimulus would be, man, I had a lot of homework today, you know, had to lift a really heavy backpack. Obviously, I'm making a lot of these situations, but you can see, you know, it's not going to be the same. It's not going to be the same. I'm not saying that people nowadays don't go through hard times, obviously, but it's just not going to be as hard as World War II, where you have an existential threat to not just yourself, but also your family, everyone you know, everyone you love, and your whole fucking country on top of that, right? Anyways. Yes. So thus, all great societies are doomed over time to lose their way. It's just the unfortunate reality of things, and give way to another nation that is following the same process, but, you know, they're from an earlier stage or in reverse. So there's always someone on top, there's always someone on bottom, and the cycle, you know, typically switches that up, you know, given enough time. It's just the way of humans, I suppose, and I'm not necessarily certain that there's a way to get around it. Of course, there are ways to protect yourself. We'll get to that later on. Anyways, we'll start this one off with ancient Egypt. I want to go through the specifics of this because you probably heard people like Ray Dalio speak about this before, the rise and fall of great empires. And look, I have the utmost respect for Ray Dalio. It's just he never really goes into the details of what happened during these times. And I want to take this presentation to go into the details of these times so that you can see and have a reference point to relate all of these things later on, because I think that's where we can really tie all of this together. But again, if you just want like the, you know, of course, the classic analysis, check out Ray Dalio. He is amazing. He is great. He is a great man. He is a great man, although he did not participate in World War II. Anyways, we'll start it off with ancient Egypt. They were kind of rising to their prominence in about 2700 BC, and they lasted quite some time, actually, 1700 years almost, you know, from start to finish. Anyways, Egypt started off with hard times. That was, again, around 2700 to 2000 BC. And they were experiencing, you know, the Nile flooding, famines, invasions, which forced unity and innovation. Unity is a really big thread here, by the way, really big thread. Because of these hard times that collectively a civilization is experiencing, it forces them to band together if they want to have any real shot at overcoming their trials and tribulations. Then strong pharaohs started to centralize power. They built irrigation. So, you know, these hard times really forced them to think outside of the box. They had to get creative. So they built stuff like irrigation. I mean, imagine this. This is like 3,000 almost, holy shit, this is actually close to like 5,000 years ago, because we're in 2000 AD. This was like nearly 3,000 BC. So this was actually closer to maybe 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. And they were figuring out irrigation at that time. You know, like our sprinklers in our gardens that water our plant automatically. Yeah, they figured that shit out about 4,000 years ago. And organized massive construction. You know, they were building real cities. It's actually amazing. I mean, you can go see the fucking pyramids today. They're still standing. And they had a shared belief in divine order. So again, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to believe in a religion, but you have to have some sort of shared belief, shared story that, again, keeps people unified. Society needs to be unified behind a story. And again, I'm not trying to promote like one religion or one story over another, but I do believe after doing all of this research, that is a really fucking focal point of all of this. You need a shared story. And right now, one of the biggest issues in the US is that we don't. I mean, you know, people believe all kinds of different things. In very, very strange ways too. Anyways, From those hard times, strongmen were created to create, the advancements that allowed them to have good times, and that happened around about 2000. So they were, experiencing about 700ish years of hardship before they flipped around into the good times, which lasted about 500 years, from 2050 BC to 1550 BC. So this was a long time, long time. Again, I want to put context on this as well. These good times are longer than America's even been alive at this point, by almost double. Anyways, stability and order brought agricultural surpluses, wealth and flourishing of art, science, and religion. Military conquests, especially in the New Kingdom, expanded Egypt's wealth and prestige. Citizens identified strongly with empire and pharaoh. Really, really important point there as well. People were happy and nationalistic, basically, which is actually kind of looked at as like a bad thing nowadays, which after doing this, the research for this, I just do not agree with that. Anyways, from those good times, weak men were created. This was about a 350-year process from 1550 BC to 1200 BC. Wealth led to elite corruption, as usual, bloated bureaucracy. That sounds familiar. And luxury at the top also sounds very familiar. Bloated bureaucracy, again, a big common thread here you'll see. Pharaohs became more concerned with building monuments to themselves than with military or civic strength. So again, the people at the top just forgot, or it's not, they kind of did forget the lessons of the prior pharaohs who were successful. Actually, that is kind of it. And then over-reliance on slave and foreign labor and tribute eroded citizen discipline. And then from those good times, from those weak men, hard times came once again. This was a process that took, a couple hundred years almost, from 1200 BC to 1070 BC, a little bit less than that, I suppose. And economic strain from overbuilding and wars, heavy taxation on farmers. I mean, these are just terrible. Like, this is also another common thread. Farmers just getting fucked. I don't know why, but they really like to get fucked in history. Coinage and grass markets distorted. Inflation pressures, again, huge common thread here. They basically did introduce inflation or currency debasement, I guess more accurately said. Foreign powers like the Libyans, Nubians, Assyrians, Persians invaded, and by the late period, Egypt was a shell of its former self and eventually falling under Macedonian and Roman control. And I want you to also recognize this as well, or at least I would like to bring up this point. Keep in mind, these hard times started about a little bit more than 3,000 years ago. And is Egypt doing well today? No, they are more or less irrelevant in their region. Maybe they're slightly, kind of closer to the top there. But even then, in the Middle East, there's much more significant powers than them in their area. So, once this decline happened, they're more or less done. The people who grow up and live in Egypt today have almost no relationship to the people who were these strong men in hard times, who were great men, who created a great civilization. They're just living on the ruins of people that they don't understand and can't live up to. And again, I'm not saying this to shit on Egyptian people right now. Actually, one of my good friends is Egyptian or has Egyptian heritage, but I just want to highlight that once you're done, you're done for a while, if it's in this case. Now, there are some other scenarios as well, but this is typically what happens. Moving on from there, we have Persia. That was the next major empire to arise. This was from about 550 BC to 330 BC. So, a lot less in overall time, to be fair. But we'll go through it. Hard times started around about 650-ish BC. This is what created the strong men. You were experiencing tribal wars, harsh geography. You have the Iranian plateau, which forged a lot of resilience. Cyrus the Great and early kings imposed discipline, justice, and unity. Again, there's that unity word coming again. And strong values. Tolerance of different cultures and religions built loyalty. So it's all about building that unity in some way. It doesn't necessarily mean that you need to force everyone to believe the same thing, but you need to build that loyalty and unity to the overall state. In this case, it would be Persia. From those strong men, it did create good times that lasted almost 100 years, from 550 to 486 BC. This was like the good times period is what I'm trying to say. So that was almost 100 years. That's a good amount of time. And this is when the empire expanded across 3 different continents, becoming wealthy and secure. Standardized coinage, the Daric and the royal road system boosted trade, and stability allowed flourishing of art, architecture, and culture. And then from there, they experienced about 100 years of basically good times leading to weak men. And so you could kind of even say that their good times maybe was more so around 150 years, as it kind of spans the majority of both of these periods right here. And that's when court life became luxurious. Kings became increasingly detached. Like, they didn't really care about their citizens as much anymore. Again, a lot of corollaries to ancient Egypt. Nobility grew corrupt. Yep, there it is. Bureaucracy bloated. There it is again. Like, it just fucking happens, man. Heavy taxation on provinces fueled resentment. Again, taxation is another form kind of inflation, as inflation is basically a hidden tax. Tax is just an unhidden tax in a way. And again, just puts extra pressure on people. And anyways, failed Greek invasions by the Persians, I should say, drained resources and prestige. So basically, they were overextending themselves in war and were not successful in that endeavor, and paid the price resources wise. By the 4th century BC, around 400 BC, records and hoards show that silver content in the siglos coins was reduced significantly, and the debasement reflected heavy costs from endless wars against Greece, rebellions, and the satrap revolts. So again, debasement, taxation, bureaucracy bloating, and disunity, big threads right here. And then, of course, weak men come around, which create hard times, and that took about 170 years, from 400 BC to 330 BC. Succession crisis and weak rulers fractured stability, military discipline eroded, reliance on mercenaries weakened loyalty. Again, there's that loyalty and unity coming up. When Alexander the Great, obviously from Macedonia or Greece, invaded, Persia was rich but brittle, and they did fall eventually to him. And the empire collapsed rapidly despite its size. And again, where is Persia today? Well, I mean, now we have Iran today, but Iran and Persia are not the same thing at all. And if you've ever met an Iranian or a Persian person and you call them Iranian, they will typically correct you and say, no, I'm Persian. That's very different. Or if I made the mistake once, because I had a friend when I was younger who was from Iran, and we called him Arab, I guess, and we didn't know any better. I mean, we're just fucking 12, 13, 14 years old, and he would say, no, we're Persian. We're not Arabs, we're Persian. So Persian people really don't like to be conflated with that. There's some sort of long rivalry going between Arabs and Persians, I guess. But ultimately, my point is that after their fall, which was 230-ish years ago, I mean, they're still more or less irrelevant, at least the Persians. In fact, recently they're kind of taken over by the Islamic Republic. That happened actually not that long ago as well, about 40 to 50 years ago, I believe in the 70s or 80s, something like that. Basically, the Islamists took over in Iran, and now the Persians are kind of they're just getting shoved further into the bowels of history, I guess. Anyways, very sad story, but yeah, once a great, very powerful empire as well. Anyways, from there, Athens was the next major world power. You could also read this as ancient Greece, but obviously Athens was the major player in this. I mean, they were just city-states anyway, so we look at it as Greece because that's where we see Athens, but it was really Athens, as the major power here. This is honestly my favorite one as well, to be so I might have a little bit of a bias here. But yeah, ancient Greece or ancient Athens, your hard times started around about 800-ish BC, lasting until about 480 BC. So we're talking about a nearly or a little bit over 300 years of hard times creating strong men. That's when, Greece's geography, if you're familiar with it, it's very poor farmland. There's constant conflict between the city-states and also surrounding places as well. And that demanded resilience and innovation. Of course, many people know the story of ancient Sparta, which was renowned for its resilience, or at least the resilience that they tried to employ within their military. And they also had great innovation as well from this period. Strong leaders and disciplined citizens in the city-states built armies and navies. Hoplites, of course, are some of the most famous of those, and also incredibly impressive as well. At least for the time, they were, really, 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 really militarily advanced. And wars against Persia unified Greeks under shared values of freedom and civic duty. And so, again, you have this sort of outside force that is trying to invade, in this case, Greece, And what does that do? That unifies Greece. Because remember, it was mostly city-states. Yes, Athens was at the center of it, more or less, but all of the different city-states might as well have been different countries. But because they were receiving pressure from outside, that forced them to unify, and that unity created great strength for ancient Greece. And so from there, strong men's created good times. This took, again, about 80-ish years from 480 BC to 404 BC. This was effectively their time where they had victory versus the Persians. They had great confidence from this. Prosperity and cultural output is what typically happens from, whatever the major war, the major victor from that war typically has. And Athens' golden age, created democracy, philosophy, from Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, architecture. The Parthenon was built during these times, as well as all of the other amazing structures in ancient Greece. And trade, science, and arts flourished across city-states. Again, this was a great time for about 80 years of amazing times, and even bled into the next sort of 60 years or so. That's your good times creating weak men. So prosperity started to breed complacency, factionalism, and luxury. Again, similar sort of thing. Internal conflict, the Peloponnesian Wars between Athens and Sparta drained resources. So they had internal conflict, so more or less a civil war. Again, I understand that these are different city-states, but realistically, when we're looking at Greece as a whole, which was great because they were more or less, or at least they were more unified in the few hundred years before this due to the wars against Persia. This started to really tear them apart, obviously, when they fight each other. And so politics became corrupt as they typically do. Discipline eroded, unity eroded. You could basically read that as silver coinage, their drachma, was gradually debased to fund wars, which created inflationary pressures. Really fucking bad. I think, as the Greeks would say, malakas. I don't know. Feel free to correct me if you're Greek here. My Greek is probably terrible because I learned it from Assassin's Creed. Anyways. Those weak men then created hard times. This was a period that lasted almost 150 years, from 338 BC to 146 BC. Athens was defeated by Sparta. Again, that was their civil war, more or less. Then both weakened by endless wars, amongst other things. Macedonia, leaner, hungrier, and more disciplined, conquered Greece under Philip II and Alexander. And then, of course, after Alexander the Great's death, fragmentation and infighting left Greece vulnerable, and they were ultimately absorbed by Rome in 146. And actually, that's probably their greatest accomplishment, because Greece didn't really fully lose prominence. They more or less absorbed into Rome, and Rome actually really prided themselves. Ancient Rome really prided themselves on their connections to ancient Greece. They really aspired to be like the ancient Greeks in many ways, and they took a lot of things from them. So you could say that, yes, they basically kind of fell off the face of the map around that time, but in a way, spiritually, Rome was their successors, both, I guess both in a literal way, and then also in a theoretical way. At least that's the way that I kind of look at it myself. Of course, if you want to go by the book, yeah, we'd say that's when ancient Greece just fell off the map. And again, I have Greek friends who I absolutely love. They're fucking great people. But when we compare ancient Greece or ancient Athens to the people living in Greece today, are these the same people? No. I mean, Greece is right now known as, one of the most corrupt countries in Europe. They are known to have all sorts of internal issues. And of course, they're no longer in any way, shape, or form an economic powerhouse, even within Europe, let alone the whole world. So I just want to highlight here that once you kind of fall off, you're down for the count for a very long time. But I would argue in this particular case, ancient Greece did get absorbed more or less by Rome, and they kind of lived on there, even though not technically correct. Anyways, Rome was the next one that came about. This was from about 500 BC to 480. So this was a very, very long-running empire here. Nearly 1,000 years. And of course, hard times started in about 509 BC, lasting until about 264 BC. So this was, a 250-year period or so. And this was when the founding of the Republic was coming about after overthrowing their monarchy. They were surrounded by enemies, of course, the Etruscans, the Gauls, the Samnites, Carthage. So they were fighting constant wars, which forged resilience. So these were their hard times, creating these very, very strong men. And the citizen soldiers, the legions, built discipline and loyalty to the Republic. That was, in fact, one of the biggest things for Rome. You even see it in their flag right here. One of those letters corresponds to basically, loyalty to the Republic. Again, correct me if I'm wrong, for the ancient Rome enjoyers out there in the world. And then, of course, this ended with Rome's victory over Carthage. That was like their main enemy in the First Punic War in 264. At least their main enemy, their main rival, their main adversary during this period, I should say. So this is what allowed them to rise to prominence, was this sort of this great, crazy, strong enemy, which was a powerful rival. But because, iron sharpens iron, or diamond sharpens diamond, whatever the fuck the saying is, you get the point that we're trying to make. These two behemoths going at each other, the one that overcame victorious, or came out victorious, this was going to create very, very strong men who basically created amazing times, which led us into 264 BC to 180 BC. So almost 100 years of this sort of period. This is like really the golden age. And so the Punic Wars were going on during this time, 264 to 146, more or less. That's when Rome defeats Carthage, dominates the Mediterranean. They expand into Greece, Spain, North Africa. Really, no one was even on their level at this point. So they really didn't have any, major enemies that could truly challenge them. It's just more like annoyances. By 27 BC, Augustus establishes the empire. So if you didn't know, Rome actually started out as kind of like, a republic, right? And that republic lasted about 500 years, from 509 BC to almost, 0 AD. It was a little bit before then, but you get my point. 27 BC, very, very close. From there, they turn into an empire, like an actual empire with an emperor, which is kind of interesting because, in today's world, we think, especially in the Western world, democracy, republic, these sort of things are the highest aspiration. But actually, ancient Rome went from that to an empire at the height of their strong men going into good times period. Now, this actually could be argued as the beginning of their sort of downfall, because that's what created weak men, right? So this period lasted between about 180 to 284 AD. This is basically, we're focusing on the period after Marcus Aurelius, who you probably have heard of before. He was one of the great Roman emperors. There's really only like 5 great emperors, and then after that, it was a lot of really bad ones. In fact, the one that directly followed after Marcus Aurelius was a really fucking bad guy. But the guy before Marcus Aurelius was perhaps arguably the best emperor that Rome ever had. So at the height of their empire, and I want to specifically say the word empire here because they were quite literally an empire with an emperor. They were no longer a republic. That was actually when they had the best of the best times. And the guy who preceded Marcus Aurelius was actually named Hadrian, and he's widely considered the best Roman Empire. Marcus Aurelius is obviously maybe the most well-known one, and he was also very, very good as well. But of course, his fame comes from, I would imagine, mostly his writings in Meditations, which is a great book, which you haven't read. You should probably read it. Anyways, after him, political instability grows, and that's an understatement. The guy who came after him is really, really fucking bad guy. Inflation from debasement of silver denarius. That's when this really started to get going. Around this time, let's just call it about 200 AD or so. And corruption, civil wars, declining discipline in the legions. Again, just these same threads continue to pop up. Over-reliance on mercenaries. Elites grow decadent. And the crisis of the 3rd century, around 235 to 284 AD, the empire fractures into 3 parts temporarily. So, again, you're losing your unity. You're inflating the currency or debasing the currency, more or less the same thing. And you got corruption on top of all of this, in your civil wars. I mean, that's going to lead into some pretty damn bad times. But again, I want to highlight the amount of years that are going on here. From the time that strong men are creating good times to the point where weak men are created, this was about 500 years, from 264 BC to 284 AD. This is a 500-year period of like pretty fucking good times. Yeah, during the end of that, they were starting to decline a bit. But even then, from the time that they really started to debase the currency and fell off the map, this was a period of almost 200 years. This is a period of almost 200 years where they were actually like still experiencing like pretty good times, to be honest. But yeah, weak men create hard times. That was a period between 284 AD to 476 AD. That's when Diocletian and Constantine reformed, but only temporarily stabilized. So it was like too little too late, honestly. Economic strain, taxation, plague, and barbarian invasions intensify. So they're getting hit from all angles now. Economic, they got corruption, they have environmental pressures, and then they have outside external conflicts as well. I mean, it's just like it's too much at that point. The system isn't robust enough to handle all of that, and slowly it collapses piece by piece for the Western Empire. Now, many people will tell you that the Eastern Roman Empire, known as the Byzantines, were the real Roman Empire, and they kind of lasted for a little while longer with Constantine in Constantinople. But well, I mean that is true, but they still did fall as well. The Ottomans took them over, actually. Anyways, by 476, the last emperor deposed by I cannot say this name, by Mr. Odoacer, was the official fall of Western Rome. Yes, it did kind of go to Eastern Rome, but again, they lost their prominence at that point. It really was done. It really was done. Like these were, again, this civilization at this point was just completely irrelevant. And again, still today, Italy, Rome, is more or less irrelevant. The people living in Italy right now, these are, they're probably very nice people. They're very relaxed people, but these are not the same fucking people, back in 500 or even 200 BC. They're just living on the ruins of great civilizations, not really understanding how the fuck they got there. And that's, again, a common thread through all of these. I'm not trying to pick on the Romans. I love ancient Rome, or at least the history of it. I'm gonna take a sip of this water while we get into Spain. Enjoy the graphics here. So you'll notice that there's actually a big gap between when Rome fell, which was around 500 AD, to Spain rising to prominence. There was about 1,000 years in between there. And this is kind of known as the Dark Ages, more or less. There wasn't like a real major world power during this time, or at least not one that I feel comfortable covering on this presentation. Maybe there were nations that were a little bit more prominent than others, but there wasn't like a real true world power that was taking over, the world at that point. Until Spain. Spain was experiencing hard times during the Dark Ages, more or less, 711 AD, 711, great name, all the way up to almost 1500 AD. This was, a century of struggle during the Reconquista, fighting to expel the Moors. They were, they had, a common enemy, which was forcing them to unify, more or less. This forged resilience, military strength, and unity under Ferdinand and Isabella. In 1492, Granada falls, and the Reconquista is complete. Columbus discovers the New World. Spain emerges as a united power. So again, they had these very, very difficult times that forced them to adapt and excel, and they came out on top during this time. And that's when strong men came about. So now we're talking about the period between 1492 AD to about 1588 AD, almost, again, 100 years of basically the good times really starting here. So this was, again, a long time. So Spain rapidly expands overseas, into the Americas and the Philippines especially. Vast inflows of silver and gold create immense wealth. This also was starting to kind of, cause some issues, right? Because you got this massive influx in newly found wealth, basically. So it doesn't necessarily cause issues at this exact point, but that will become an issue later for sure. Charles V and Philip II make Spain the dominant European power, and the Spanish Armada is built, so now they really started to take military prominence over the seas, and the Catholic Church power extended as well. And the golden age of Spanish art and literature was really going strong during this time. So this was like 100 years of like strong men and good times. This was the more or less golden age, not to use like a bad term just because, this was also the time where they were like really finding a shit ton of gold in the New World, mostly in the Americas. Then, from those good times, weak men were created. This took about another 100 years, from 1588 AD to 1650 AD. And in about 1588, the Spanish Armada was defeated by England. So England starts to rise a little bit in their own way. and Spain started to decline in naval supremacy. So their military starts to get beaten. They start to lose their power over the seas. Maybe this was due to just I guess they got a little bit complacent at the top after 100 years of more or less being unchallenged in that way. And they started to experience endless wars in Europe. Netherlands, France, England drain resources through, wars that they're kind of always fighting, little conflicts here and there. It adds up a lot. Silver imports now become an issue because they're really triggering inflation by this, which caused a price revolution actually in Spain during this time. And that hollowed out the domestic industry. So it completely fucked people actually living in Spain. And the nobility, as always, grows decadent. Bureaucracy starts to get bloated, and peasants are heavily taxed. These three things are just they're so on the nose with all of these civilizations, more so even than inflation or currency debasement. Like, these three things really fuck you up. Heavy taxation, especially on the middle and lower class, really bad. Bureaucracy bloated, really fucking bad. Nobility grows decadent. But these are all obviously symptoms of the issue. They're symptoms of the issue. Anyways, weak men then create hard times. And this was a period, more than 100 years, from about 1650 AD to almost 1800. And Spain, slowly loses dominance to France and England. Economic stagnation comes about. Corruption is very rampant during this time, of course. It just gets worse and worse. 1700s, the War of Spanish Succession from 1701 to 1714 further weakens the empire. So again, just more pressure on poor old Spain. By the early 1800s, Spanish colonies in Latin America began declaring independence. So now they're losing that former source of wealth as well. And they're probably also, they are also at the same time trying to devote resources to taking them over, but they just can't keep it up at this point, especially with the ongoing wars in Europe. They're caught between a rock and a hard place, and they have to let them go. So they also lose the amazing wealth that they were getting from those colonies too. And then Spain just becomes a secondary power in Europe, by the 1800s. And again, today, people love going to Spain. It's a very nice place for sure. I've heard great things about it. But when we think about the Spanish people of today and compare them to the Spanish people of about 500 years ago, these are not the same fucking people. They're from what I understand, work ethic is not their strong suit. Okay, I'll put it that way. And these, the people living in Spain today are just living on the ruins of a formerly great society that really did rule the world and had great discipline, great unity, and great strength overall. And this has been going on for a long time. But again, I want to emphasize that the time between the strong men and good times versus good times creating weak men, this was, about 150 years, from almost 1500 AD to 1650 AD. It's a long time. That's a long time at the top, more or less. And then even from there, it took another 1500 years or so for them to decline into irrelevance. So I just really want to highlight how long these periods take. Anyways, the Spanish give way to the Dutch. The Dutch, very, very powerful, very, very impressive, especially for such a, relatively small nation, honestly. The Dutch are among the most impressive, in my opinion. Now, again, you might have your own opinion, but we'll get into it here with the Dutch. The hard times really began in about 1568 AD to 1581 AD, so actually a relatively short period here. That was when the Dutch revolt happened against Spanish rule, which forged resilience. So again, they had an outside enemy. The outside enemy or rival created the internal need for unity and advancement to overcome this. And the constant warfare and flooding, defenses built unity and discipline. We refer to the Polder model here. Which is what the Dutch created. And in 1581, they declared their independence, and the Dutch Republic was formally established. So I should actually once again highlight that Spain more or less ruled the Dutch until this time. And so Dutch actually had to literally fight for their independence, which again is just another form of this sort of outside pressure creating the need for a nation's unity in order to overcome that. But this one, very direct, because you're having the former world empire, strangling you, leading to, the new world empire, basically. So yeah, the Dutch Republic was formally established in 1581, and that's when, the good times begun and strong men were firmly in charge. And that was your Dutch Golden Age. That's when trade, finance, and naval power dominated the world. The Dutch East India Company, founded in 1602, it was the first multinational corporation and stock market, basically. So this one actually is a very interesting kind of case study. Amsterdam becomes a global financial hub. If you haven't ever been to Amsterdam or just the Netherlands in general, you will notice that there is a really wide diversity of people there, honestly. And I'm saying this as someone who went there, 15 years ago, who lived there for about a month or so. And I can say before all of the immigration and whatnot that we've seen in recent years, it was actually still a pretty diverse place. And that's just representative of how interconnected it was due to its trade. And again, trade is actually a big focal point in the strength of a nation. Is just being very adept at trade and being very trustworthy in one case, and then also obviously having the world reserve currency doesn't hurt. It actually kind of makes you a very attractive partner in trade, and also allows you to exert your own pressures over others to force them to trade with you. As the old saying goes, when goods don't cross borders, boots will. Referring to soldiers' boots crossing the border if you won't trade with us, basically. Anyways, they had cultural flourishing during this time. That was the Rembrandt period, the Vermeer. Probably saying it terribly because, the Dutch got all that fucking weird throat shit going on, that shit. And then Spinoza. But again, these good times lasted almost 100 years. This was like the top of the top. 100 years of strong men and good times. And even then, the good times leading to weak men, that was another, 50 years about 40 years, a little over 40 years, from 1672 to 1713 AD. In 1672, that was the disaster year, the rampjaar, as they say in Dutch. They experienced simultaneous attacks by France, England, and others, which exposed vulnerability. Basically, they got caught in the same predicament that pretty much all European world powers get caught in, which is all of the Europeans are playing a game of King of the Hill. I mean, we all are basically, but because Europe is also close to each other, they're just constantly playing this game of King of the Hill, where it's no, we're gonna fucking attack you until we whittle you down, and then we become the world power. And then it's just all of them just basically take turns during this. It's kind of funny. Funny for me, but obviously not for them. Anyways, expensive Anglo-Dutch war. So with England, drain resources, debt more so than debasement in this case. And I really want to highlight this in the Dutch are a little bit different than most of the other ones, because almost every other great empire really experienced significant debasement. The Netherlands actually didn't as much, but they did take on a shit ton of debt. And that's what really started to weaken them here. So the weak men started to take on debt to fund themselves, to fund these wars, to fund everything. And again, it's just because they hadn't earned it before. They hadn't earned those initial lessons. So they think, we'll just take on the debt. That's fine. There won't be any problems with this. Obviously, this is not going to work out well for them. Anyways, over-reliance on finance and speculation, naval supremacy shifts to Britain as they start to take over the seas, and political infighting weakens the Republic, and they have a loss of unity. Again, infighting, loss of unity. Again, in this case, debt rather than debasement, but and then just constant wars, really. And of course, during this time, there's a big focus on owning the seas. So that's why Spain, the Dutch, the French, and the English all kind of take turns, being world number one in this time. And it's all due to their navies. And the reason why that is because it facilitates trade. When you own the seas, you more or less own the trade, or at least you can set the rules for the trade. So it is very important to have a very strong military as I take a sip of this water. And then their weak men leading to hard times. This was, again, a period of about 100 years. So these things take time. Again, from the time that they were strong men and having good times leading into weak men, that was about, a little over 100, about 120 years. 120 years of just generally good times leading into the weaker times. And then the hard times themselves took about 100 years before they, fell into irrelevancy. But the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 cements Britain as the dominant naval and colonial power. Dutch trade and empire steadily declined, so they no longer have, this amazing income coming in, and they have all this debt as well. So they can no longer service the debt, basically. and the Dutch trade and empire steadily decline. Economy stagnates, heavy taxation, because what do they look to? Once they can't actually create the wealth for themselves through actual business activities, what do? They try to tax their citizens more, but of course that's not going to work because their citizens, like they can't make up for that, obviously. Like they rely on that themselves. That earlier trade is what I mean. And then they experience corruption as usual. And by the late 1700s, the Netherlands were reduced to a secondary power, more or less eclipsed by Britain and France at this point. And again, the Dutch today, are they irrelevant? Are they not irrelevant? They're certainly not a world power today, but they're not in a terrible space, more or less. I would say, at least compared to the other ones. I mean, shit, compare that with fucking ancient Egypt. Like, it's night and day here. But my point is that it's not the worst thing in the world to lose your world number one power. It's not like you're immediately going to go into complete destitution, but you more or less go into irrelevancy, and you kind of, you give up your spot. And, well, it's not so much. I mean, I don't think the Dutch are like hurting that much right now, but they're certainly not in charge of things in their portion of the world. Like no one gives a fuck what like the Dutch prime minister says. I don't even know if it's a prime minister there, to be honest, but they don't, no one gives a fuck what their opinion is on the world stage. Like if their leader comes out and says, hey, Russia better stop, invading Ukraine, they don't even hear it. They don't even listen. Anyways, the Dutch gave way to the French, and the French were more or less an empire from about 200 years or so. Their sort of hard times were around the 1500s to the 1600s. I'm not super exact with these numbers here. It's kind of difficult to get these ones or get like a starting point, so I kind of estimated here. That's when they were experiencing religious wars. That was the Catholics versus the Huguenots, which devastated France for about 40-ish years, from 1560 to 1590. Then Henry IV, from 1589 to 1610, restored order and unity. Again, major fucking point here. So they had initial wars, then they were forced to unify in order to overcome this, and that set the foundation for centralized monarchy. Strong Bourbon kings consolidated power. That led to Louis VIII and Cardinal Richelieu. French is not very good, but again, that is when the good times or the strong men started to create good times, and that was a period that lasted about 100 years, from really 1643, let's say, to 1715-ish AD. That's when Louis XIV, the Sun King, builds France into the most powerful nation in Europe. Versailles symbolizes wealth and control. As you probably know, if you've ever been there, it's still pretty fucking amazing, honestly. Flourishing of culture, philosophy, and art. That's when you had Descartes and all of them guys. In France, dominates militarily and culturally. So they have a very, very strong military during this time. Again, this was a period of about, let's call it 70 years of the best of the best times. They still experienced like pretty decent times after that until about 1789 AD, when weak men took over. But I just want to again highlight that from about 1643 to 1789, more than 100 years, close to 150 years even, they were, it was pretty good. It was pretty damn good. Yes, during a portion of that they were declining, but you wouldn't have been complaining if you were living there. I'll put it this way. Anyways, the successors of Louis XIV were weak and detached, extravagance and corruption at Versailles, while peasants suffered. Again, just the leaders didn't give a fuck about the peasants anymore. They taxed them significantly. They overtaxed them more or less, to people who didn't have money anyways. And they had costly wars, the 7 Years' War, the American Revolution. They actually did help out the Americas during that time, but obviously it cost them. And that just bankrupted the treasury. National debt explodes, heavy taxation of commoners, especially as well. And Enlightenment thinkers exposed, the Enlightenment thinkers during that time exposed the hypocrisy of monarchy. So again, during the early portion, the monarchy was actually their strength. Why was it a strength? It was a strength because it unified them. It taught them the lesson of discipline and unity during that time when they needed it. But later on, it became a weakness. Why? Because those later on monarchs didn't have to actually earn their spot in unifying the country against, external threats. Thus, they started to do all sorts of dumb shit, which naturally leads to their downfall. And that started around 1789 and led till about 1815 AD. So again, this period, this was actually a pretty fast downfall, about 25 years almost. 1789 was a French Revolution, right around the time that the Americans had their own revolution, and the monarchy was overthrown, and chaos and bloodshed, ensued. And I just want to take a moment here to kind of highlight the differences between the American Revolution and the French Revolution. The American Revolution was basically like a nation-building time, whereas the French Revolution was a nation-destroying time, brought upon by disunity, whereas the American Revolution was brought upon by unity, more or less. And very, very different results here, too. I mean, basically, the French Revolution led way, it was in a way like a communist revolution. That was a major underpinning philosophy during this time. And actually what followed the French Revolution was, it was the reign of terror. It would have been an absolute terrible time to been around in France, even if you would have thought that you would have been on the good side or the winning side. Because even then, it was such a fucking, it was such a mess, man. You wouldn't have wanted to have lived during those times for sure. So years of instability, the reign of terror, civil war, rise of radical factions. Rise of radical factions is very much an understatement here. You had absolute fucking lunatics on both sides, but especially on the, on the communist side there, or leaning towards the left side, basically. Napoleon seizes power in 1799. So again, you have an emperor coming back. He restores order and expands France briefly. So they actually do have a small period of resurgence here. But ultimately, Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo, and that ended his empire. So they actually were one of the only nations to maybe have brought themselves back from the brink of destruction with Napoleon. Obviously, Napoleon made some mistakes, particularly in Russia, and then obviously he completely lost it at Waterloo. And so once that happened, their military was no longer powerful. He could no longer unify the country because, well, they had been devastated and demoralized from these losses. And so what happens? France is reduced in power compared to Britain. And then who takes over from there? Of course, it's Great Britain. Great Britain from about 1707 to 1920. Let's just go back here for a moment. Actually, I just want to again highlight, we already did highlight the length of the good times. Don't worry, we'll go over all of this at the end as well. Great Britain, this is an empire that lasted from about 1707 to 1920. And before we move on as well, I do want to say with France, France has obviously given way to other stronger nations, but they still do enjoy a relatively strong position in the world, but they're certainly not the world number one power. So I don't want to make it sound as if just when you lose your prominence as world number one, that it's all over from there. No, that's not necessarily true, but hard times do typically come after that for a while. But France, now, many people would argue right now they're actually having some very hard times. Hey, I wouldn't argue against that, to be honest, but it's not like it was before. Anyways, Great Britain. Great Britain, hard time, started around, 1400s to 1588 AD. This is when England is, it's just a relatively small island, very vulnerable kingdom, often overshadowed by Spain and France. Even at some point, Rome was ruling over England. The Wars of the Roses in 1455 to 1487 nearly tore the nation apart. But of course, from that extremely nasty war, grew what? It grew unity. The Tudor dynasty restores unity and centralizes power in order to overcome this. And in 1588, as we went over earlier, they defeat the Spanish Armada, which really marks Britain's arrival as a naval force. And they're still known as a naval force, even up until World War II, where they were a naval force. I don't know if they're really considered nowadays, but Britain is still decently powerful nowadays. Certainly not a world number one, but they still do enjoy a lot of power. Anyways, from then, strong men started to create good times. This was a period between 1588 AD to 1815 AD. So this was a very long time, more than 200 years where, they're growing. They're maybe not number one during this whole time, but they're growing and they're on the up and up. And that's a very exciting time for any nation. More than 200 years doing this. And that's when they're establishing colonies in the Americas, the Africas, Asia. 1707, they have the Act of the Union, which creates Great Britain. 18th century, they have the Industrial Revolution, which fuels immense wealth and military power. And by 1815, they had victory over Napoleon at Waterloo, which Britain just becomes the undisputed world leader. They beat the former empire. They now have the most powerful military. They have no real threats that can challenge them, especially in the sea. So they're ruling over trade. Things are pretty fucking good at this time. And even into the next period from 1815 to 1914, they're doing quite well. Yes, these good times did lead to weak men, but they were still, they were still the best place to be. Pax Britannica from 1815 to 1914. Britain rules 25% of the world's land and people. London, it was like the sun never sets on the British Empire. It's amazing. London becomes the global financial center. Again, great trade hub, connected to many different things. But wealth and empire breed elitism, complacency, and class division, as usual. By the late 1800s, their rivals, the Germany and the U.S., industrialized and challenged Britain's dominance. Obviously, the U.S. then had their revolution and, got away from Britain. But then, soon after that, really, the U.S. and the U.K. became like the best of friends, special relationship, as they like to say. But Germany was a real rival and has more or less always been a rival until recent times. For many nations, actually. Anyways, from there, weak men create hard times. This was from about 1914 to the 1970s. You had World War I. Britain wins, but it's such a it's such a war of attrition that they win at such a catastrophic cost. It destroys them anyways. They've lost so many resources in this. They completely fucked themselves up. They took themselves off the gold standard right before World War I in order to finance World War I. Then they actually went back on for a period in 1930s, and then they realized we don't even know how to price this thing, so it completely fucked their economy again, and then they just went off it again for World War II. And by that time in World War II, they're completely exhausted. They've been bombed by Germany. They're financially and militarily depleted at this point. They can no longer exert their power over the world. And the U.S. and the USSR, now known as Russia, emerge as the new superpowers. 1956, the Suez Crisis marks symbolic end of British global dominance, and by the 1970s, Britain is a secondary power within NATO and Europe. Now, again, I want to highlight here, Britain is not off the face of the world at this point, but they are certainly not world number one, and they do have many issues still, but it wouldn't be... Well, many people would argue it's not the worst place to be fair. And I want to highlight here again the amount of time that was spent between your strong men producing good times and your good times producing weak men. This was a period of, almost 300 years where they were rising for 200 of those years and then falling for about 100 of those years. This is a long time. And even then, from their fall to more or less irrelevance, this was about 50 years. It took a lot of time. Anyways, I think you know what's coming next. It's the good old United States. Very much on the nose with this graphic right here. I should add. But yeah, the United States, relatively young, only started in 1776. And again, that was your hard times. Your hard times were from 1776 to about 1945. Understand that the first 150 years or so of America, or actually, I guess more than 150, like 175 years of America, that was hard, especially up until World War II. You had the fucking Great Depression for one, and then two, when the Americans won their revolution versus the UK, it wasn't like they just immediately became amazing. Anyways, in 1776, the revolution against Britain happened. That forged unity, sacrifice, and resilience. Again, the colonies had to come together and overcome this absolute powerhouse in Britain, who was more or less, overseeing the Americas at that point. In the 1800s, you had frontier hardship, when people were trying to expand west in the United States. You had the Civil War in the United States. So again, this, is objectively a bad thing. The Civil War, disunity is very, very bad. And that was around 1861 to 1865. And the westward expansion built a national identity. So once the Civil War concluded, that's really when things started to look a little bit more up, I would say. By the late 1800s, early 1900s, industrial growth and emigration demand, discipline, and innovation just absolutely exploded in Americas. And of course, it was doing pretty damn well up until about 1929, which is when the Great Depression happened. That lasted about 10 years until World War II. In World War II, at least America's involvement in it lasted about 4 years, but that really helped to unify the nation and solidify its power. So the U.S., did it win World War II? I mean, obviously, this is no one really. There was no like one exact winner, but it was among the biggest beneficiaries of World War II. The U.S. I mean, first they used it. The U.S. used it as an opportunity to trade with the allied nations like the U.K., in France, and Russia as well. And so the U.S. grew a lot in that way. And then at the end of it, the U.S. actually joined in the war, and I mean, we didn't actually win it, but we played a big part in solidifying the win over it. But yeah. Anyways, that solidified the nation at the end of World War II, and that's when really the good times began, from strong men. So those strong men, they just went through World War I, the Great Depression, and World War II, and came out on top. So they're going to be the winners. And the good times go from about 1945 to 1971. Now, I don't know how history will look at this in the future, but what I'm measuring here is up until the point where America goes off the gold standard and starts to really debase the currency. That's the point that I'm trying to highlight here, which is 1971. So anyways, these good times are lasting, if we measure from exactly that, it's going to be about 30-ish years. Post-World War II boom, of course, the U.S. becomes the wealthiest and most powerful nation in history. The bread and wood system, which was 1944, the U.S. dollar becomes the global reserve currency. The middle class thrives, innovation soars, you got the space race, technology, medicine. There's a very strong national unity during this time. Nationalism was very, very, very high up in the United States. Global leadership in military, the economy, and culture. But of course, in 1971, what happens? Nixon ends the gold standard, and that's when I would kind of say the weak men started to maybe come about. That was also about a generation after World War II. But if you notice, or if you've been paying attention throughout this presentation, you'll know that this is like pretty short amount of time compared to all of the other nations. So I don't know if we look at this through the lens of history, if this will hold up. But because the issue with currency debasement became more prominent around 1971, that's where I'm kind of taking this from. So it's very well that I might be completely fucking off here, but we'll measure it from this point. And again, just understand my logic here. You might disagree with it. That's fine. Draw your own conclusions as always. Anyways, Nixon ends the gold standard. That is the start of fiat money and inflationary cycles in the U.S. and basically around the world. Outsourcing of manufacturing hollows out the industrial base. So you start to lose the middle class, expanding welfare state, rising entitlement mentality. So before this period, the Americans were very, very individualistic and very, pick yourself up by your bootstraps, very proud individual people. Now starting to go into more collectivism, not like actual collectivism, but just, drifting in that way. And political polarization grows. As we know, it's only gotten worse. And cultural cohesion weakens. And by the early 2000s, debt accelerates, military overextension in the Middle East wars. There's just been kind of endless wars throughout this whole time anyways. But in the 2000s, especially, we started to have more and more money printing. Why? 2008, the global financial crisis, and then even further accelerated in 2020 after, of course, the Rona times. And so, again, I want to highlight the strong men to the weak men period here. This is going to be about 50, 60-ish years, something like that. So it is certainly on the lower end. But could we argue that, maybe this picture is not complete? Yeah, absolutely. Could we argue that, later on we might have a completely different reference to this? Yeah, absolutely. Definitely possible. But we could also argue that because of technological advance, because of how things are so interconnected now with trade and the global economy, that this process is generally going faster. I think that's also a good argument as well. And in fact, we'll revisit that soon. But anyways, weak men creating hard times. So that's about 2008 to present. And of course, we had the 2008 financial crisis, which exposed the fragility of the debt-driven economy. And what was our response to that? It was to just print more money. And by printing more money, we did not solve the issue that created it. We just kind of kicked the can down the road and did it again in a big fucking way in 2020. So this is what kind of has me concerned, or it's not kind of has me concerned, it has me concerned. We had trillions in quantitative easing and money printing to sustain the system, rising inflation, wealth inequality, and cultural fragmentation. Absolutely an issue right now. So disunity, national debt surpasses GDP, deficits accelerate. 2020s, the U.S. is still the dominant power, but signs of overreach and internal decay resemble prior empires at their late stage. That's my main point here as I take a sip for this water. In other words, or in short, not good. Anyways, let's look at this from the perspective of debasement. So what I'm charting here is the survival of empires after inflation or currency debasement. They're more or less the same thing for our purposes. But you can see in some cases it's really not been that long. You know, for Athens, for example, it's only 25 years. Britain, only 40 years. United States has been about 50 years since this issue really started to get going. Persia lasted 70 years. Once you started to really debase the currency, France about 75, Netherlands 120, so very long. Egypt 130 years. Ancient Greece about 260, Spain 250, and Rome 270. So again, this is from the time that the nation really started to debase their currency to the time that they actually fell. So is the United States very much early within that cycle? If we look at these as historically relevant, then yes, 100%. There are some instances where that has not been true. Sure, Britain and Athens specifically, but I would still look at this and say the United States is generally early. We look at this as like kind of a little bit too early if it did fall right now. Just personal opinion. That's how I kind of interpret it. And then also I wanted to look at this from one other angle as well, the timeline of currency debasement and collapse of an empire, but also measure the percent decline in currency integrity. So you can see here, these percentages relate to the percent decline in currency integrity. So basically how much did the currency debase throughout that time? And we can see if we measure the United States right now from 1971 to present, we've had about an 85% currency debasement. And that is very much in alignment where, you know, most of these nations did hit kind of like the critical point where it was like the point of no return, more or less. But still, you know, this period from right now would be about a little over 50 years. If we look at Britain, for example, that was 60 years, so kind of close. If we look at France, that was about 70 years. So again, very close. If we look at Athens, that was actually a much longer time. This took about 250 years, a little bit more maybe even close to 300 years. Persia, about 130 years. Spain, about 250 years. And then Rome, about 250 years as well. So again, we're a little bit further ahead in that schedule, but you might argue, or a good counter argument would be that more recent empires were a lot less, like France and Britain, which were closer to like 70 to 80 years or so. And again, right now we're about 50 years. So that's more relatable, I'd say. Anyways, just putting it into words here, how long do empires remain at the height of their power? So now I'm just looking at the good times before decline clearly set in. So Egypt, this was about 500 years. Persia, this was about 220 years. Greece, this was about 200 years. Rome, this was about 200 years as well. Damn it. Rome, this was Rome, about 200 years. Spain, about 150 years. Netherlands was about 100 years. France, about 100 years as well. Britain, about 150 years. And the United States has been about 80 years. So when we talk about just the height of power, the United States still a little bit earlier on that schedule. It would be the shortest period of time that an empire has ever spent at really the height of their power at 80 years or so. Again, kind of a an estimation here, but again, gives us a sort of northern light to see where we're at. Even Britain spent, about double the time that the United States has been at the height. Of course, France and Netherlands spent a lot less time at the height. Spain also 150 years. So, we would kind of look at Netherlands and France as the odd men out, whereas everything else is, decently more. From this perspective, I would say, yeah, it's still pretty early to really expect the United States to really fall. Even the good times, you could even argue that the good times are still kind of here. Like, again, we don't have the perspective of the future to really relate it from. This is something that only historians in the future will know. Right now, this very well may still be a great time. We won't know how good of a time it is until the future. Anyways, then I wanted to relate the years in decline before irrelevance and collapse. So this is just weak men into bad times. Egypt, this was a 700-year period. Persia, this was a 100-year period. Greece, a 200-year period. Rome, a 300-year period. Spain, a 200-year period. Netherlands, a 150-year period. France, 150 years. And Britain, about 75 years. And right now, the United States, again, this is currently debated, but signs of decline maybe for the past 50 years or so. Again, I'm just measuring from when Nixon took us off the gold standard for the dollar, which was 1971. So a little bit over 50 years. Again, this would still be on the lower end of that. Only Britain comes close at 75 years. Everything else is, 150 years or more. So this would be on the lower end, I would say. Anyways, consistent threads amongst all of these. Sound beginnings. You have discipline, shared values, innovation, unity. Amazing. Prosperity, which leads to prosperity. You have surplus, expansion, cultural golden age. That's when it really is the good time, so to say. And then that leads to decay. That's your corruption, overextension, money problems, again, debasement, and erosion of civic duty. People no longer feel loyal to their nation. And then the fall, that's when either you get invaded, you lose your major war against a leaner rival, or you just get replaced by another country that's just straight up hungrier than you are because you're not as hungry. You didn't have to earn it because you're not experiencing bad times. So I want to acknowledge here that debasement of currency is almost always happening. I mean, shit, in the US, we have we aim for a 2% CPI, which is a 2% inflation year over year. So just debasement in and of itself is not a death sentence. Heavy debasement absolutely is. What defines heavy debasement? Well, let's say what an acceptable level of debasement would be. It would be about 2 to 3%. That historically seems to be okay. You can sustain a golden age with that amount of debasement. You get into major fucking issues when you start to go above about 5%. These do not seem that much different, but understand the difference between 2% inflation and 5% inflation is 150%. It's fucking big. It's really fucking big, and it adds up quick. And if you sustain that for many years on end, it seems to become a point of no return. Anyways, so it only becomes fatal when it outruns productivity, destroys trust in money, and forces the empire to finance itself through printing instead of strength. Again, forces the empire to finance itself through printing and strength, printing more money instead of strength, meaning that you finance yourself by just printing more of your currency rather than actually earning it through producing more. That's the issue. We are taking something that we did not earn. That is really the crux of all of this, because later on, after your empire has experienced great times, you no longer have that sort of cultural impetus to be a strong man. So what do? You start to reward yourself when you should not be rewarded. It really is that simple. You cannot overextend yourself in that way. And for that, and this has actually really helped shape my own worldview, you cannot, even though you could theoretically print more money, you should not unless if you've actually earned it. You cannot do that if you want your nation to remain great. Anyways, that's when collapse becomes inevitable. Anyways, I want to go over a couple of case studies here, just a little bit more in depth, to go over what happened after their fall. And we'll do this with the most recent ones, France and Great Britain, because these are very well documented, and they happened like the most recently. So France, they led into a revolution, whereas Great Britain was kind of like a slow decline. And here's the difference. In the 1780s and 1790s, France issued paper money, the assignats, backed by confiscated church lands. They printed heavily during this time, which caused massive inflation, and the assignats collapsed to near worthlessness. So they just issued paper money. It wasn't related to gold or silver or anything like that anymore. And naturally, they just printed more and more of it. People realized, oh shit, this is literally valueless. Pieces of paper. In response, gold and silver coins skyrocketed in value relative to the assignats. I mean, again, that's kind of one of the things that people say about Bitcoin. It's like the denominator as USD is worthless. Like, so what is Bitcoin's value? It's infinity in a way. Now, I'm not saying that that's true. I'm just saying that's the perception. And you can see it at work here as well. So citizens hoarded metal, gold and silver, and the government even banned gold and silver trading at points because people refused the paper money. And again, like we kind of have that right now. You can't walk into a store and give them fucking gold or silver. I mean, it'd also be like super not like easy to do. It'd be very encumbersome, but you can't even do that. You can't even do that. And the bottom line here, gold preserved purchasing power when the paper collapsed. And then what happened with France? They went into a revolution, and it was fucking awful. That is exactly what you like. If you're going to lose your status as world number one, a revolution is the worst way. It's absolutely the worst way. A lot of pain during that time. And it just been a fucking mess to been around. Great Britain, again, World War I and World War II. Britain left the gold standard in 1914 to finance World War I. The pound steadily weakened. Gold's official peg was unstable, and after the war, they tried to go back on gold, but at the wrong rate. We spoke about this a little bit earlier. So you had deflation plus economic turmoil. And this is really bad. Like deflation is honestly terrible. You do not want deflation. You might want disinflation, just a lowering of the rate of inflation, but you don't want deflation. Very fucking bad. That's going to destroy the quality of life for just about anyone. In 1931, Britain fully abandoned the gold standard again, and over the next decade, the pound lost 90% of its value versus gold. So example, in 1900, 1 ounce of gold equaled 4 pounds, and by 1970, 1 ounce equaled 35 pounds. So tremendous debasement there. Gold massively outpaced the pound's decline. And even in the US, I realize that my face is kind of covering it right here. Let me actually get rid of it for a moment. In 1971, Nixon ended gold convertibility. So that was the Nixon shock. The dollar detached from gold, and the US entered its fiat era. And what happened during that time? Asset prices went straight to the fucking moon, and more or less have just been up only since then. In fact, they were pretty much up only before then as well. but yeah, bad time. Anyways, gold soared from $35 an ounce in 1971 to $850 an ounce in 1980. And guess where it's at now? I actually don't have gold versus the ounce right here. Let's look at, say, USD. Yeah, $3,759 for some gold. Not fucking good, man. Again, gold absorbed the loss of faith in paper. So that is the playbook. The playbook is hard assets gain value when currency debasement happens. And that means that our answer to this issue is to buy more assets, hard assets particularly. So let's talk about some critical thresholds based on history that effectively create the point of no return for the world empire. And this is specifically from the lens of currency debasement. And we're going to look at the debt to GDP ratio. Most empires entered terminal decline once debt consistently exceeded 100% of GDP. I'll read that again. Most empires entered terminal decline once debt consistently exceeded 100% of GDP. Why? Why would that be? Because your GDP is basically the amount of output of value that your country is making. Yes, I understand this is not a perfect measurement, but it's good enough for our purposes here. So it's the amount of value that your economy is producing. If you are taking more debt, relative to the amount of value that you're producing, what are you doing? You're living above your means. And if you're living above your means, what's going to happen? As we just went over about 3,000 or 4,000 years of history, you're fucked. You're fucked. So Rome, heavy military taxation. The effect was the debt and tribute burden of about 80% or more. In Spain, 150%. Debt to revenue by the 1600s. Repeated bankruptcies during this time. France had 90% debt to GDP before the 1789 revolution. Dyslexia speaking again. Britain had 200% debt to GDP after World War II. That caused their loss of reserve status, the loss of world reserve currency status. The U.S. today is about 120% debt to GDP, already inside the historical danger zone. And the signal here is that when debt is greater than 100% of GDP, dangerous. When debt is greater than 150% of GDP, that is collapse following within decades. Now, as of right now, the U.S. is not at 150%. It's at 120%. So it's in the danger zone. This is not where you want to be, especially for a long time. Absolutely no. Even just being above 100% of GDP is bad enough. And I've actually even brought up the world debt clocks over here. I realize that the public debt to GDP ratio here is 100%, but the external debt to GDP ratio is 61%. So those do add up. So yeah, the US is somewhere around like 120, and that is danger zone. That is typically getting very close to the point of no return if you remain above there for, I think it's around like 10 to 20 years, something like this. I could be wrong in exactly that time, but 150% is when you are collapsing within about a generation or two, or actually about a generation, about 20 to 30 years. So yeah, something to be aware of. Anyways, annual inflation and currency debasement. I just want to highlight a few more things here about what would be considered healthy and sustainable. Healthy empires kept, so actually I was wrong earlier. I quoted 2 to 3%. It's actually 3 to 4%. Healthy empires keep inflation and debasement below 3 to 4%. So that's your CPI. I understand CPI is not totally indicative of your real inflation, but 3 to 4% CPI, it's kind of like your safe zone, more or less. You can maintain that while continuing to inflate. It's just a lower level. That is maintainable. But when it creeps into the especially 5% plus, and it's sustained, that's when the money loses credibility. And we had a period of like that recently. That was in 2020, or the period after 2020. Inflation crept up to like 8 or 9%. Now, that was a very short time. There was inflation about 8 to 9% for less than a year, or around a year, something like this. Now it's back down around about 3%, or a little bit below 3%. Some people think that it's even lower than that. So I would actually say that the Fed has done a pretty good job of keeping things back into normality. I know that might not be a popular statement, but hey, from this lens, I think that was the right thing to do, especially with, asset prices still going up. Anyways, I do want to highlight that Rome, the denarius silver content was less than 5% by the end of their empire, and that's when the soldiers started to demand gold. They weren't going to give them gold, obviously, so problems ensued. Also causes internal strife. Spain, they had an influx of silver, which doubled prices every year. So again, they were actually having great productivity. I mean, they're collecting all this silver from their colonies, but that caused an issue in and of itself. And that took about 30 years. And bad things happened. France, again, that assignat, the inflation was between about 7 to 15% yearly before hyperinflation, and then they were done. Even more modern than this, the Argentina and Venezuela situation had about 20% plus of sustained inflation, and again, that caused a collapse and spiral. So these weren't even, obviously world number one powers, but they were still, pretty prominent nations at the time. But even then, inflation fucking destroys them. So inflation is just a nation killer, man. It really is. Above 5%, big early warning signal. You really don't even want to live above there for more than absolutely necessary for like a few years. Sustained above 10%, you're gonna collapse. Your risk just goes off the fucking charts. And that's the fatal combination. Debt greater than 100% of GDP, and inflation 5% or more for several years. Almost every empire in this zone entered into irreversible decline. Is the U.S. there right now? It is for the debt above 100% of GDP. That is true. Inflation, however, is not. Real inflation from true inflation, that might be a little bit higher. So that could be an issue. But Need both of these things for several years, and then yes, you are in the critical zone. So I do think that the U.S. is still perhaps salvageable at this point, but it is, it certainly is at a point where you need to be taking action. Need to absolutely be taking action. So there's two ways that you can solve this. You can either increase your GDP, or there are a few ways to solve this. You can either increase your GDP. So like Trump needs to get on the TV and say, hey guys, fucking work more, be more productive, you lazy fucks. Of course, the government can set in policies and whatnot that make productivity easier by reducing, red tape around things and reducing regulations. These sort of things can help promote that. They could also reduce the debt. Very difficult thing to do in today's day and world. Why? Because no one wants to give up their entitlements. Fair enough. So good luck campaigning on that. But that would be another way, just reducing the debt. I think Elon's trying to do that with Doggy, or at least reduce the wasteful spending, at the very least. And then of course you could also just try reducing inflation. This easier said than done. Very, very complicated scenario. So honestly, in my opinion, the easiest way to work your way out of this is just increase productivity. That would be the most relevant way, I think. Again, I just want to highlight here the high probability signal of downfall. That is when debt is greater than 100% of GDP and inflation is 5% sustained. If you are greater than 150% debt to GDP and greater than 10% inflation, collapse has always followed within about 1 to 3 decades, so 10 to 30 years. Relating that to the US today, debt to GDP, this would be around 120%. So we are above critical right now. Absolutely. Inflation, we are around 2-ish to 3% as of the recording of this video in 2025. It did spike a little bit above 8% to 9% in 2021 and 2022. That was the first modern warning shot, of course. And as of right now, the reserve currency status is intact for the U.S., but already questioned globally. You have alternatives like BRICS, and this places the U.S. right at the historical danger zone. We're not in the all hope is lost zone, but we are certainly in the danger zone. So need to increase productivity, need to reduce debt. Hopefully both of those things would be good, but we shall see. Time will tell. And the U.S. has already crossed the historical debt threshold, and inflation has begun flashing red. Every empire in history that has entered this zone, Rome, Spain, France, Britain, could not recover. The question now is not if, but when. Anyways, just a chart here of what we're looking at as well. Here's where the U.S. stands as of this moment. You can see other nations and what they've done as well. And then the final analysis. So here's where we'll end it. Most empires enjoy about 100 to 250 years at their peak strength before cracks start to show. Decline periods are often longer than golden ages, dragging out over centuries in ancient times, especially, but much shorter in modern times. Quoting Spain and Britain specifically here. Technology, communication, and global competition accelerate decline today, or at least that would be one major point that I think more doomers would focus on. By this metric, the U.S. is right on historical schedule, peaking about 80 years after World War II and showing familiar signs of decline with debt, inflation, and cultural erosion. If the U.S. accelerates, if the U.S. accelerates inflation to 5% or more with a debt to GDP ratio of 100%, which we already have, then it's all fucking ogre. Or you give it like 10 to 30 years. So what happens next? Well, we could have one of two things. We could have revolution like France, not fucking good, very painful. We could have a slow decline like the UK. Also painful, but not as bad. They still enjoy like a pretty decent spot in the world. Again, you might be living in the UK right now and be like, this place fucking sucks. What are you talking about, Crone? I understand, but or maybe say it's amazing. I don't know. But again, the solution as far as you and I, individualistic people, is to buy hard assets and do your part to grow the economy if you're in the U.S. to avoid this issue. But yeah, that is my presentation. Very fucking long here. I do apologize about this, but like I say, I'm absolute nerd with this sort of stuff, and hopefully you've enjoyed it to some level. Maybe I break this up into a couple videos. Maybe probably should have broken it up into a couple videos, but I hope that if you've listened this long, you've gotten some value from this video. I'll continue to upload more pieces of content to this long-term investing video. And let me know what other topics you would like to see covered, as I've really been enjoying making these. So I'll leave it right there, and I will see you in the next one. Take care.